Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of a Q&A actually with myself, conducted by Ernie Smith, who's the editor of Tedium, a website that can probably best be described as an interesting look at the dull side of the internet. That's his words, not mine. You can read Tedium over at tedium.co. Ernie and I spoke on July 3rd, 2018, and, just again, this sort of table-turning interview dynamic is something new I'm doing to mark the third year anniversary of Don't Die. If you want to read more interviews I've done over the last few years, you can go over to NoDon'tDie.com. You'll also see a link there to my Patreon for you to help support the work I have been doing and am continuing to do. Other than that, here's Ernie Smith. Thanks.
I'm Ernie Smith. I'm a writer. I do a newsletter called Tedium. I basically try to cover a lot of very obscure things in my writing. I try to focus on telling the stories of things that aren't necessarily front of mind for people. A lot of that actually covers video games, but it's not limited to that. It covers a lot of old culture. It covers a lot of old technology. It covers strange questions about mainstream things, and it's a little all over the map, which I think is pretty cool. I think in terms of asking you questions, what I think is really interesting is just sort of kind of cracking into what makes somebody else come up with a side project of their own. What makes somebody ambitious and interested in trying to build something themselves and to see where it takes them.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one thing I'll ask to start off, before this, what kind of things did you, as somebody who runs a website and does interviews, what kind of projects did you work on before that point? Not necessarily as a journalist, but just for yourself.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because it may or may not surprise you to learn. Other than playing in bands and doing weird audio collages, I think maybe the through line for a lot of my life is just doing weird things without words, because that's just what I have, I've been saturated with as a professional, as an adult. It's just always dealing with chunks and chunks of words. So I've always been a fan of doing things that allow me to be free of thinking about that. So, but those are sort of bedroom 4-track weird noise projects. A couple of years, actually, the year that I had started this, earlier in that year, I had started this project called Floppy Dump. It's intense. It's okay for you to laugh. It's intentionally what the hell, and that was I don't know what it's conjuring up for you, so I better describe it really quick before you just assume it is whatever.
Please,
you think it is.
I insist.
So that was just a thing I started where I went to a Goodwill in the Bay Area after the Game Developers Conference, which is held every March in San Francisco, and I was hanging out with some friends, and we were just sort of going around after it was over, and we stopped in at this Goodwill, and for some reason I found a box of diskettes, and I chose to buy them. I think just out of just sort of like one of those random, why not serendipitous things. Um, and I tracked down like a USB floppy drive. And I started this project where I opened a PO box and sort of just invited people from all over the internet or all over the world to send me their 3 1/4 and 5 inch floppy disks, and I guess sort of in a way it is like spiritually like a embryonic sort of kindred spirit thing to Don't Die, in the sense that it's like at least from my perspective, it's examining stuff like humanity rooted in technology that um, you know may completely disappear if we don't make some sort of document of it. Um, it was weird, it was interesting. It's a thing I'd like to get back to, especially because it's a little bit more. It's very much the opposite of what I'm doing now, because it's much more autonomous. It's not as dependent on like scheduling, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
it's asynchronous in the way that scheduling interviews is not. And I found all sorts of. I just liked the unexpected nature of it, where I mean, there is the mystery of whose discs were they, how long ago were they last used, why were they abandoned? I mean, obviously, there are some things we can assume, like it's really hard to find those drives. But I don't know. I think I've always been that sort of person who is captivated sort of by the unknown. I don't know. Maybe I'm waxing too much, romantic with floppy disks and stuff. But that was the first thing I had done that sort of was like wholly, self-elected and, public facing. Like it was a thing where curtains up and people knew about it. And I still have, I'm staring at it now, across from me, I have like a stack of boxes of diskettes. So it's a thing that like I'll get back to sooner or later, but it's interesting that like, I think I probably picked the right lane as far as like the project to sort of stick with, but there are aspects of that appeal to me, and I think that like there's other stuff I'd like to do in the future. But yeah, I mean, I wish I could tell you. I'm kind of surprised too that I'm like, yeah, I just did like one before this for a little bit.
It's weird because I mean, as a creator myself, I always feel like I always have had these wild ideas,
Yeah.
like in terms of what what I want to do, and I think that what I sort of found was that I had a job, I would say about a decade ago, where I found it very creatively fulfilling. I found it like I found it like the most amazing thing, and like I put a lot of my heart into it, which which was really a kind of weird thing looking
Mm-hmm.
back, because it's just sort of like, when it comes down to it, like I was putting all my heart into something that was effectively owned by another company.
Hmm.
And and so like kind of the point that I think something really hit for me, like the point where I kind of figured this out. And this is not to criticize anybody. It's just sort of saying that I personally made this realization around this time. Was I don't know if you know a lot about my background, but I was a graphic designer for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
I mostly worked in newspapers, and so one of the things that I did was I had designed a cover for the publication, which was like a tabloid size newspaper for young adults. It was basically newspapers for millennials, which
Yeah.
which sounds really hip, doesn't it? Um, But in all seriousness, like the publication was great. Like it was doing some very ambitious things for being in the newspaper industry, and I had fallen in love with the idea of like this is the kind of stuff I want to keep doing throughout my
Yeah.
career.
Yeah.
But anyway, I designed this cover, and it was basically a cover about monster movies, and I had done some illustrations. I think I was I think I used my Wacom tablet to like kind of drop some like very primitive, some very primitive like illustrations of monster movie type things, and like I found I found like a very cool texture, because I think that one of the things that I would always do with my designs is I would always find these weird textures and just blend the heck out of them in Photoshop. So anyway, I designed this cover, and it has a lot of visual elements, and it's also like very type driven. And what I sort of discovered, what I sort of discovered after I'd done it, like I was really happy with the cover. I was very impressed with it. But I talked to my editor, and my editor basically agreed, like it was a really cool cover. You know,
Mm-hmm.
do you think, and she said something along the lines of, do you think it would be okay to sell it on a T-shirt? And at that point,
Hmm.
that was the point where I just sort of realized, yeah, I've been doing all this awesome work for somebody else.
Yeah.
and and there was like, it legitimately was something that she could have asked, and it made a lot of sense that, like, while I put all that work in, and like, granted, I still work for a company, and I still do creative things while I'm at the job.
Yeah.
I think I made the realization that, like, I got to have something to do outside of outside of the day job. And I'm assuming that that probably drives a little bit of it for you. Am I right in reading that?
Uh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should add too. It's funny and very typical me. Where I'm like, oh wait, there was another project I did before. Just you're mentioning all the Photoshop and blending of textures. In the early to mid to late '90s, I actually ran a project. So this is me as a teenager, similar. To what I'm doing now, but I was running an interviews archive for the band Nirvana in the wake of that band's dissolution.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that too. Like I wound up like doing a lot of Photoshop art for other people who didn't have Photoshop at the time. I think software in a way was like harder to pirate back then. It's really odd that like me, like I think we had it legitimately. I guess I don't know what's the statute of limitations. um,
I'm not even sure.
I think sort of the theme that runs through is like definitely what you said of like skills I want to put to use professionally that like maybe I'm not asked to do with the paying work, but there's also the inverse of like the similarity between like I think it was just called like the Nirvana interviews archive or something. I think it got absorbed into some bigger fan club site at some point because it just seemed wrong to like run a thing like that for years and then like just delete the domain and you know. I think the similarity there is like it inverted to being an interest in what others have already said and going to like using interview skills and just journalism curiosity and such to uh, exploring questions that like I felt like I couldn't ask at one of my other gigs. So I'm definitely with you, and I wish I could tell you like I don't know if there's like a specific moment, but I think like it was more of an accumulation of like yeah, like I feel like I have a lot of questions to explore around video games, and I don't know if there's more now than there were then. I think it's one of those things where it's like you don't really find out the answers, but you sort of like scratch an itch, and then you realize like you're you're itchy like 10 other places as well. So yeah, no, I would definitely agree with you that it's like it's sort of like I wonder how often, maybe that's just like the nature of doing these types of creative elective projects, is like it's energy you have that isn't being it isn't being asked of you, like like for your regular jobs. Like I'm sure that's why most people wind up doing things like this, right? I guess I don't know.
I mean, I think that that's a big part of it. I think that there's so much that people want to do when they build things,
Yeah.
that they want to have something off to the side. And I think as well, like there's also this issue of where if you make it your full-time job, like where like if you decide one day, like
Hmm.
I'm going to spend all of my time, you know, just writing about the stuff that I'm passionate about. Like, one, you have to figure out if there's a market for it, and that like you can actually like you can actually feed yourself and pay your
Hmm.
mortgage or your
Hmm.
rent,
Hmm.
and also you have to figure out like what that would look like. And then there's sort of more as a existential thing, where you're basically, you know, you're basically in this spot where you're passionate about something, but now that it's your job, now that that's a thing you do every day,
Right.
does it lose its luster? There's this great piece in Wired a few months back where Pat the NES Punk, like he was kind of approached him like a profile of him from the perspective of, here's this guy who's been working full time for 5 or 6 years doing nothing but talking about video games. Like, this is something that he grew up with, that he was very passionate about, and now it's his job, and it's been his job for a while.
Yeah.
Like, does that change, how does that change things for him? And I think that that's a problem that, beyond him, beyond you know beyond like any specific person, is something that any creator who gets into what they're doing seriously,
Yeah.
rather than just like kind of building it for themselves, or they're trying to build it for an audience, and they're dedicated to a schedule, and they're receiving money for it in some way, shape, or form,
Yeah.
like that they inevitably run into.
I feel like I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I feel like that's like or at least, last time I had a sense of this and sort of what people were talking about with all this, like, I feel like that's an unarticulated, I don't know if problem is the right word. I don't know if that's putting it too strongly, but it's definitely like a thing to be mindful of, especially, I mean, I guess in all fields, right? Video games is a professional say like, oh, it's a passion industry, but I think all things are passion industries, and whether it is, you're a pundit, or you're a critic or podcaster, whatever it is, like there definitely is a thing where if it goes unchecked, this thing that used to be uh, solely a passion, pursuit, you risk burning out. Um, I guess, I mean, I don't know if it gets cheapened because it starts to get exchanged for money, or something else that people expect to get from you, instead of like like, oh, I have a live journal, and I just sort of, I just sort of post whatever, whenever, like it's, I guess when it shifts from being more of an organic freeform reaction to like um, not even assembly line, but like a regular thing, it changes something about the person in the output. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I think that that's absolutely it. Like I think that there's often this tension between creating because you love it
yeah,
and creating because there's some sort of outward commercial pressure or outward like life pressure, like and to be honest, like in some ways, like us with our little projects, we deal with this in small ways. Could you imagine like being a member of like of a major rock band, like Nirvana,
yeah,
For example, and they have to like come up with like they have to come up with their own little slice of life every 2 years.
yeah. I mean, I guess
Not because
I was just gonna say, I guess they're a weird example and a good example of how those pressures are not good, or if you're not equipped to deal with them, you will crumble under them. You know?
yeah, and that's absolutely it. Like I think that there's there has to be a balance, and I mean certainly certainly some of my other side projects have kind of fell victim to this in the past. Like
Mm-hmm.
before I did Tedium, I did this aggregator type site on Tumblr called Shortform Blog, and was it was very freeform, which is good in a way, but it was also freeform in a bad way in that like it was completely tied to the news cycle, and if the news was really busy and it was 2 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah.
I still felt compelled to post on the site, like it's and I think that I think that certainly that's great when you're you're a business and you have like a staff of 50 in your newsroom trying to cover every single part of the world of the day. But
Mm-hmm.
it definitely does not benefit one's you know sense of
Sanity.
sense of sanity.
Yeah, the well-being. Well,
Yeah,
it's balance. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I think that I think that that's really interesting. And I guess I'd be kind of curious to hear what you've kind of done as you've worked on this project and you've interviewed so many people
Yeah.
to kind of like manage this and like keep in mind like the balance between working on this project
Mm-hmm.
and living the rest of your life elsewhere.
I was gonna say just keeping my life going. Well, it's not. I mean, although like I guess I'm saying like maybe this is the third. I guarantee you there are going to be other projects I remember that I just sort of blurred out in my memory or just sort of not coming to mind. But it's definitely true that this continues in the tradition and skill set that I have honed over my career. So there certainly are aspects of it that come more naturally just because I have muscle memory of producing interviews and guiding people through. But also this benefits from another thing that I have muscle memory of because I have been freelance for so long, which is if you hadn't brought up the word balance, I would have right here because it's a thing I am very much mindful of and try to be the guardian of, to the extent that I mean, I try to run my day to day as though I was still going into an office. I try to stick to sort of 9 to 5 hours. It's been a whole journey with like being flexible on the balance, but I couldn't do this or function at all if I was still operating, and I used to operate in that way you were talking about, where it's like, oh, there's something 2 a.m. I have to take care of it, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's good to be proud of what you're working on, but what I have sort of come around to much more these days is trusting in the fact that you can sort of make these strategic in the moment, forward momentum moves, for yourself, for your projects, that you don't need to be grinding yourself away 24/7 all the time. In fact, like, I think you risk getting myopic when all you think about is what you're doing. But I have that track record of being mindful of, like, when I will check my email. I will never, it's rare, like, if anyone hearing this or anyone who knows me, like, it's rare to get an email from me on weekends. I'm also vigilant about this on my cell phone. I am always on do not disturb on my cell phone, but I don't have a family. I'm a single dude, so there are certain extra luxuries I get to have in sort of protecting my ability to be present. Like, I'm not really a fan of the way that many of us are sort of expected, especially in journalism, and I'm sure in other fields too, but the expectation that, like, you are to be on call all the time. And I mean, I've had those journalism jobs where that was expected of me. It's probably like the way that I operate now is a reaction to the way I used to have to operate before, which is, if a concert announcement happens on Saturday, you have to write it up on Saturday. I think just, like, the work suffers when you do that. And I think, like, if you're not out experiencing, whatever you're into or whatever you would like to be into, if you're not just out there, it doesn't even have to be outside, but for me, it frequently does mean being outside away from screens. Like, you miss out on the opportunities of bringing that richness of life to what you're doing. So I don't know. I mean, at the same time, like, I will feel like, I wish I could be as quick to respond, like we were talking about before, on our emails. Like, I feel bad about it, but I get it. Like, it's impossible to stay on top of everything. It's actually something I would be curious to ask you about, is, like, I don't know how often you hear from your readers, but I mean, do you feel they have a sense of, like, Tedium exists because you chose to make a series of sacrifices? Like, do people realize that, or do they sort of treat it like, you work for them?
I think that there's a little bit of that. I do think that what I would say is that often I don't find readers necessarily to be the problem. What I to be clear, when I say problem, I mean, like, the thing that kind of sucks away the time.
Yeah.
I often find it's one of two things. It's either
Mm-hmm.
it's either sort of the technical things that kind of go into the process, like kind of the ins and outs of like trying to build something and realizing you got to, like, improve it. I work in email, so as a result, like,
Yeah.
email works a lot differently than, say, trying to like build a website. Like, you're working with web technology that really last had its best evolution in 2002 or 2003.
Yeah.
It's old technology. You're right. You're building stuff out in tables, and you have to figure out how to automate things, and you have to make sure that the links all work. And
Yeah.
like, it's in like, I spent a lot of time, like, trying to, like, ease the process, because I was realizing, I made the realization one day, like, MailChimp is costing me way too much money, like, for the number of subscribers I have. And if I keep with them as I grow, like, it's going to be like this thing that where, like, it just, like, it just seems like it shouldn't cost as much money as it does. And then the other thing too is just, like, I'm spending what feels like 2 hours every single issue just copying and pasting everything from a website into an email, and it just doesn't feel like it makes any sense.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time, like, trying to figure out ways to automate this process. I found another email host that like is a lot cheaper and like it and like as a little bit more of a mom and pop type shop, where so like in other words, if like I
Mm-hmm.
have an issue, like I can actually like email like somebody who's like a CEO or like or like high up in the company, even though it's like three people.
Yeah.
And I think and the other thing too is like I think that there's also this element of things go wrong sometimes. I had an issue I did about 2 months ago where
Mm-hmm.
it was sort of pondering the creation of spam from a cultural perspective, sort of talking about its roots and sort of talking about how it became this phenomenon, how like the recent rise in robocalls, some of which are coming to people in Chinese at the moment, are kind of reflect this lineage where spammers always find a way. And I don't think it hit me until after I hit the send button that this email that was all about spam might just end up people's spam folder.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. So I mean, like there are always things like that. I would say the other thing though that kind of becomes an issue
Yeah.
is I think that I think that as you grow and you try to like commercialize things or you try to like um or you try to build things, it becomes very clear that people are always trying to like I think that there are always people who don't have your best interest in mind. They're trying to get a piece of your attention, and I think that this like takes a lot of like um
Mm-hmm.
takes a lot of different shapes. But sort of the one that I run into the most is I get emails probably 5 times a week, if not more, where it's somebody who works for some company that runs a website about mattresses or travel or something like that, where they want me to add a link somewhere on this article I wrote 2 years ago, asking so that they have like a link on their on my website that like did well in the search engine because it's a good article. Um, so that they can get a little bit more traffic so that they can improve their search engine presence. And I mean, like, I won't say that like that takes up all of my time or anything like that, but it's like those kind of asks, which by the way, if I don't reply to those emails, you know what they do? They send me another email a week later, so like I'm in like this
Yeah.
position where like like if I ignore them, they won't leave me alone. And if I reply to them, it's just like this. But it's like there are always things like that. I think when
Yeah.
it comes to running something yourself, where people will always try to they'll try to take advantage of the fact that like you're small, compared to
Yeah.
like like you're not the New York Times basically, and you don't have like you don't have like a whole department that's dedicated to business opportunities that where things like that will always happen. And I think that I find it takes up a lot of your time, but it's but at the same time it's kind of a necessary evil. Like you have to
Yeah.
like if you ever want to like make money like trying to like create things, you're kind of stuck with it.
Yeah, it's true. And I always, I know that you have at least one other guy who helps you write stuff. I don't know how big your, I don't know if you would describe it as a skeleton crew. I don't know how many people you have over there. Um, so I always feel weird when I say like, oh yeah, this project is all me. I mean, I have a web developer, I have friends and people I talk to sort of get their opinions about, interviews I'm thinking of or features for the website. I mean, I do I'm shepherding this up and over the hill, with a lot of my time and energy, which, as you said, is I guess that's sort of like the big umbrella you would put over the problems of running these projects, is like, because you chose to volunteer that energy and that time, it becomes this ongoing thing you assess of, can I spare more energy? Can I spare more time? It has to come from somewhere else. So it's just this thing that you're always managing. But like, I have people who are like, I think like in some way I feel like I've done myself a disservice by just publishing transcripts. Like people think either all these interviews are done via email, or they think somehow they're done in real time. I'm not sure. They just don't seem to understand that like each of these is their own process of producing, and then sometimes preparing, less so for me in this case, although I'm sure more for you in this case. But there are these extra things that people seem to expect of internet projects, where oh, you're a website of interview transcripts. Have you thought about doing a podcast? Have you thought about selling T-shirts? Have you thought about all these other things? And many of them I have. Excuse me. Many of them I have thought about. Many of them I would like to do. But it comes down to this problem, and I don't know if it's a cop out to have this thought, but it's like I can either tend to the garden that attracted you here in the first place, or I fear it's not like, I guess like the one way you could say it is like, it dilutes the brand, or in a more pragmatic sense, it's like I just don't have as much time and energy as I think people would like for me to have to do things like, on top of all this, also make it a podcast, also make it this, also make it that, and here are like 5 cool T-shirts. Like, I think like when you are one person mostly doing thing by yourself, it's like either I can do all of these other things and not do them that well, or I could focus on the core strength of what this thing is. But then I feel bad, like if people want those things, like I would like to be able to offer them, but then it's like, I don't want to ask artists to work for free. Like, I feel like everyone should get paid for their time or be compensated. It's I don't know what it is. Like, a friend of mine put it like, everyone's interested in the beta. They don't really care about the alpha. And I think it's like when they read your thing, they have an assumption that like you're probably going to wind up somewhere else, and they just sort of like, they want you to just hurry up and get there. Although I don't know, because like I know like with your project, you've gone on and done some freelancing. Like, do you find that people often, I don't know, I mean, do you feel like you get those sorts of things that I'm talking about? Does that sound at all familiar to you?
This actually sounds quite familiar to me. I remember I did a very brief, like, I mean, the interview itself was lengthy, but the amount of time it was actually featured was very short.
Yeah.
I basically was featured for about 30 seconds in an episode of the NPR Planet Money podcast, which is a widely listened to podcast.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Mm-hmm. And as a result of this, I got like a large number of new readers, which is cool. But I got a lot of people that just basically emailed me, basically saying, "Hey, this should be a podcast." It's just like. It's just like, I get it. I understand. I understand you like podcasts. That's where you came from. That's how you heard about this. But like, I think that you have to be very careful about like what you're willing to, what you're willing to commit yourself to. And it's just like, there are things I would like to do, and like we're kind of playing with the idea of doing like some audio transcripts of like some episodes, like not all of them and not all the time, but just basically
Yeah.
for people who want to like get the rundown of some of these things and they don't want to read 2,000 words every
Yeah.
single time out. It would be a nice thing to do for the readers, but
Right.
we're not. But that's that's something that I don't want to make the focus of it, because ultimately the focus of it is trying to tell stories via writing. And
That's the thing. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
and and there are things that sound really cool to me that like often get recommended to me. Like I had a couple of people like just this past week like say to me, hey, you should put this, you should like create ebooks of this and sell them on Amazon,
Yeah.
which sounds like a cool idea to me, but it's
Hmm.
just like I have to figure out like where to fit that in on top of the 12 other things that I already do.
I mean, I was just gonna say it's like I've had people say that, like, oh, you should have been doing this as a podcast all along, and it's like there's a thing. I think it's exactly what you just said, where it's like there's a thing about doing these types of projects where there is the person reaching out to you. There's their perspective and what would satisfy them, and then there is as the person doing it, your version of what would satisfy you in doing that. Like a lot of people have just been like, why don't you just do a podcast? It's easy. All you need to do is just share the raw audio. And I just feel like uh, if I were to do a podcast, that's not how I would want to do it. I understand people are I understand, and that's actually something that like and I'm actually that's sort of what all these interviews are meant to coincide with is like, I'm going to be I'm going to be sharing the audio of these, but I'm going to be doing it on YouTube for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's own ecosystem. There's going to be a way I'm going to be able to blend it with the website, but it's not going to be, what I would feel like would be the podcast version of it. To do the podcast version of it, I mean, I would need more than just me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I would need more than just me, and then it's like um, it would take more of that time and energy that we were talking about.
Yeah, and that's something that is really tough. And I try, I do run advertising on Tedium. I mean, like it's not like an every issue thing, but I've had enough
Yeah, yeah,
success with
yeah.
it that I have, like that that I've been able to do it. And I mean, like to be honest, like there's a good chunk of that goes, that I try to set it aside to like have like writers. I have two regular writers in the site, and then like I occasionally have other people like write something if they offer. But like
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
I'm not comfortable with the idea of like you know you guys spending all this time working on something and then like, oh, like I'm just doing it for free. Like it's something that like,
Yeah.
and I would be quicker if like for some reason everything dries up all of a sudden, like to not to just do all the writing myself again, rather than put them in a position where like they're writing for free. Because I think that if you want to write for free, do it for yourself, and then
Yeah.
build up your own brand, like and be very mindful of that, because I think that it's a real risk coming into this. Like, there are ways that like one could improve that situation. You could always more aggressively push the Patreon page, or you can always like you know
Yeah.
put more advertising on the website, or like, but it's just you just have to be very careful about like what you're willing to do. Like I
Mm-hmm.
at least there are paths now. Like 5 years ago when I was doing short form blog, like it just seemed like the only path forward for like making any money on that whatsoever were through banner ads, like by like fly by night companies. Like I would get like all these emails from people that I had never heard of, talking about their ad company. It's just like, why would I switch from Google, which actually has like a
Mm-hmm.
well-known name, to something to this company that has 12 followers on Twitter.
I get those emails too. I know what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's tough.
Yeah. I mean, something I wonder about, when you do an operation like this is, I mean, do people, I mean, like, was there a version of your thing that would have existed through someone else's outlet, or is this part of what you were talking about? Like, if you're going to do a thing, like, do it on your own.
Yeah, it's weird because like yeah, one of the first one of the first pieces of writing that was like longer than like a couple of sentences that I I had written that wasn't aggregation. I think I wrote it on Medium way back when they started, like early 2013 or so, like when I was still like an
Mm-hmm.
invite only community, was basically just sort of this philosophy, because there was a controversy at the time that writers shouldn't work for free. And sort of my response to that is like, naturally writing, it's better to get paid for writing, but if you're just starting out, like, it's, we're at a point right now where, your foot in the door when it comes to trying to write or trying to like
Mm-hmm.
do something creative doesn't need to come because like the right editor saw your stuff, or like the right A&R guy was at your show. Like, you literally can build your own thing on the internet. You know, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you can do it for cheap, you can do it for free. And like, it can rise just based on your own personal marketing skills or even dumb luck. And that I think is that I think is you know that I think is a unique thing to have available as somebody who creates in this day and
Yeah.
age. That's something that like a lot of folks in prior eras did not have access to, and I think that we as a society should do more to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. um, I think that I think though that the other thing with with creating and trying to build out different things is that you you have to be willing to paint outside the lines a little bit and try to come up with new approaches. So it's like, even if you do find a job where you are getting paid to do something, you still need to have this area where you can create a little bit more free form, where you kind of decide like what that creation looks like. And I think that when it comes down to it, both of our projects kind of do that, in that
Yeah.
and that they create, and that they're built around creation, not necessarily with the focus on like trying to appease anybody else other than ourselves. The fact that other people like it is great, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but
No, I know what you mean. Yeah. I mean, I think about, and I don't know that I've solved for this, or it's a thing I need to yet, but I spoke to this media theorist at Stanford a couple of years ago, and I don't know if it's because of their proximity to Silicon Valley or not, but he was suggesting at some point, as I continue to think about what does a version of, in my case, this oral history project, what does a version of that look like that can continue after you're gone. And I find that to be an interesting thing to think about and to return back to. I don't know. I mean, at the same time, like I've had conversations with another friend of mine who also does creative projects. He makes games, and he and I were talking about how very often the assumption seems to be if you're doing anything creative, the outward expectation or assumption is that you're doing it to get as much money as possible, to get as many audience, to get as big an audience as possible. It's like there are all these assumptions of growth rather than, I think, like maybe the through line through the types of projects that I feel attracted to, and I think in my approach to journalism in general is just, like you said, it is a little bit of that coloring outside of the lines, but I'm a big believer in like, well, just, it's worth at least asking the question and just sort of seeing where it goes. But it's something else I've learned, when you've done 242 interviews over the course of 3.5 years, I'm too close to it to have a sense of like all of the things that bring other people to it and what they're getting out of it. So at the same time, like as I say that, I'm like, well, is it sort of self-important to be thinking about like what's a version of this that can keep going, for decades and decades and decades? Because I don't know if you had an expectation how long you were going to be doing your thing. I mean, I had expected, I had like, oh, I'd be done after a year. I'm sure I would have answered all my questions by then. But at the same time, like there's this other guy out in LA I know who's been doing like a project in radio, also documenting stuff. And yeah, there seems to be this thing like, I mean, he's been doing it for 20 years. The next year will be his 20th year. And I mean, I think it's just a thing that winds up happening. Like, you keep devoting that time and energy, then you can wind up like looking up and be like, wow, I've been doing this 20, 30 years. And as you mentioned, you have like 12 other things that you're juggling. I don't know. Like, I think like maybe it's helpful to think about not necessarily like the way that these things end, but like how can they still. I mean, I think that's the thing you and I have in common with what we're doing is like we have this shared fascination in things that are either forgotten or ignored or overlooked. So I don't know. It's weird to think about like future-proofing projects like that because they're so fascinated with the past. You know what I mean?